I was reading this article recently when it began with these words. I don't know how else to put it, but lately it seems like my brain is broken. Boy, isn't that the truth. My wife and I were talking the other night about what we'd like to do in our backyard this spring, some landscaping projects we've been talking about for a while. And I had this moment where I felt to me like being a good listener there in that moment and thinking through those ideas with her was the most difficult thing in the world. I've always considered my greatest asset to be creativity, and often it's creativity in the face of limitations. Studies show that this is true for most people, that most of us are more creative when we have to wrestle with and face limitations. Give someone a blank canvas and they will probably struggle. But give someone limitations and watch them be creative. And that to me has been what's so confusing about this period in time, because what's this pandemic been if not limitations? Now, limitations for the health of a larger community, but limitations nonetheless. Have you had moments like these? Moments when you could say, I don't know how else to put it, but lately it seems like my brain is broken. I think the key to understanding is that the issue here is not the limitations themselves that have drained our intellects and imaginations. We've all had periods of time, maybe just a week or two, maybe because of family obligations or we got sick, where we had to quarantine ourselves at home. We've had to miss things like concerts and games and meetings and dinner out with friends. But the key element that makes this different is time. Prolonged periods of difficulty and limitations impede our ability to stay and feel creative. This week, 1 year ago, was the week we began worshiping exclusively online. 1 year. It's 1 year from the anniversary of the World Health Organization declaring a global pandemic. These have not been momentary limitations and difficulties. They've been with us for a while. Cognitive scientists have pointed out over the past year how living life like this has impaired our executive function, our ability to plan and to organize. We're living in a moment that, despite living relatively more simple lives, we are overloaded with change and the ever-evolving and then loosening and then tightening limitations. You might feel like your memory has declined, but most of our lives lack that key ingredient of new experiences which help us consolidate our memory and give birth to new creative ideas. Lines between work and home and parenting are blurred and have been put into one big chaotic stew of multitasking mush. You might be feeling work, parenting, partner burnout, all at the same time. This is not an intellectually healthy place to be. In this season of recovery, we've been focusing on how Jesus is invested in bringing healing in all aspects of human life. And right now, our sense of creativity, our imaginations of what's possible, our intellects, they are in need of healing. We've been looking at the miracle stories from Matthew's gospel, but today we're going to step away from Matthew for a little bit and visit Mark's gospel. Matthew tells the same story we're about to read, but Mark's telling of the story is richer. It's told with more details and insight. Just before the story we're about to read, in Mark, Jesus has calmed the storm on the Galilean Sea. He's cured a man possessed by demons on the eastern shore of the sea. But now Jesus is heading back to the Jewish territory on the western shore. So now a reading from Mark 5:21 through 43. Jesus crossed the lake again, and on the other side, a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders, came forward. And when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded with him, saying, "Please, my daughter is about to die. Please come and place your hands on her that she can be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A swarm of people were following him, crowding in on him. A woman was there who had been bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a lot under the care of many doctors and had spent everything she had without getting any better. In fact, she had gotten worse because she had heard about Jesus. She came up behind him in the crowd and she touched his clothes. She was thinking, if I could just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And her bleeding stopped immediately. And she sensed in her body that her illness had been healed. At that very moment, Jesus recognized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "Don't you see the crowd pressing against you? And yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus looked around carefully to see who had done it. The woman, full of fear and trembling, came forward. Knowing what had happened to her, she fell down in front of Jesus and told him the whole truth. He responded, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace, healed from your disease." While Jesus was still speaking with her, messengers from the synagogue leader's house said to Jairus, "Your daughter has died. Why bother the teacher any longer?" But Jesus overheard their report and said to the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid. Just keep trusting." He didn't allow anyone to follow him except for Peter, James, and John, James's brother. And they came to the synagogue leader's house, and he saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "What's all this commotion and crying about? The child isn't dead. She's only sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he threw them all out. And then, taking the child's parents and his disciples with him, he went to the room where the child was, taking her hand, and he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Young woman, get up." And suddenly the young woman got up, began to walk around. She was 12 years old. They were shocked. He gave them strict orders that no one should know what had happened. And then he told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You know, today's gospel lesson is interesting because it's a story within a story that's full of rich symbolism. A woman who has been stuck in constant menstruation for 12 years. And for 12 years, a young girl had been alive, and now she's on death's door. This story begins, like so many stories, with a person of privilege, a man of power, a leader in the local synagogue asking Jesus to come and see whose daughter who is nearly dead. An enormous crowd surrounded Jesus and followed him across the city to Jairus' house. But as they were leaving, something strange happened. Jesus was the only one who felt it, but he did. He felt the power leave his body. "Who touched me? Who touched my clothes?" I want you to imagine yourself there in that moment, surrounded by that huge swarm of people pushing in to be near Jesus as he traveled to Jairus' house. And all of a sudden he stops and there's a commotion to find out who touched this wandering prophet. Who touched Jesus? And honestly, it's more like who wasn't touching Jesus, as this crowd crushed in around him to be near him. But what's interesting, when he asked who it was, one person steps up. It's someone who shouldn't have touched him at all. Someone who is sick, someone who's a woman, someone who was bleeding, whose menstruation never stopped for over a decade. Sadly, this was a time and place where women were second-class citizens and the chronically ill people were social outcasts. She probably wasn't supposed to be outside of her house to begin with. She definitely wasn't supposed to be among the people. She absolutely shouldn't be walking up to a prophet and touching him. According to the crowd, Jesus should have scolded her. He should have cast her out of the city. He should have made an example out of criticizing her, but instead he said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Jesus held her up as an example of someone who crossed boundaries in order to pursue healing because of faith. But while this commotion was happening, with the 12-year hemorrhaging woman being healed, that time was ticking away for the 12-year-old girl, the daughter of the synagogue leader. She died. And so someone came and told her father. But Jesus overheard this message, and he told him not to be afraid, to trust. And so Jesus pares down the crowd because something miraculous is going to happen. He pares it down to just the most trusted disciples, and then they go to Jairus' house. And everyone in the house was beside themselves because this darling young girl, 12 years old, alive for as long as the healed woman had been hemorrhaging, 12 years old, entering into the time of life when she would begin menstruating, 12 years old, lying dead in a room. But Jesus insists the situation is not beyond salvation. It's not beyond repair, and goes into her room, takes her dead hand, and in her native tongue whispers, "Talitha cum," young woman, get up. Now, we don't see all the barriers Jesus crossed in order to save and heal in this story. Blood was a big deal back in those days. It was something you shouldn't touch, you shouldn't be around, you shouldn't be around things that were bleeding. If you had a condition that caused you to bleed, or an open wound, or if you happened to have been born in a body that bleeds in a certain way each time of the month, you were considered ritualistically unclean, and you couldn't enter the synagogue while bleeding. But blood did not faze Jesus. Chronic illness did not faze Jesus. Gender did not faze Jesus, and faith broke through. Now, just as blood was a big deal back then, so was not touching dead bodies. That's not so different from us. We don't make it a habit of going around and touching dead things, but Jesus crosses that barrier as well. Pay attention to the response the people had when Jesus tells them that the child wasn't dead. When he tells them that the situation is not beyond repair, what do? They laugh at him. Now, Jesus, he's many things: inspiring, prophetic, saving, giving, self-sacrificing, wise, loving. But funny is not something the Gospels put in his top 10 personality traits. Jesus was never the type of preacher that everyone loved because he told folksy stories that made you laugh. He was never the one that had the perfect sermon illustrations that just made the crowds chuckle. So why are they laughing at him? This is the meat of today's gospel truth and how it challenges us here and now. What is our response to the possibility and promise of healing or miracles in our lives? We are well versed in cynicism. Cynical laughter is our defense against the things that seem preposterous or impossible. In fact, over the past few years online, it's been common to hear terrible news and then see someone posting a meme in response that just says, #nothing matters. We have been saddled with affliction upon affliction, the loss of loved ones, the diagnosis of an awful disease, day to day dealing with a chronic illness, the black hole of poverty, the crushing weight of anxiety and depression and isolation, losing a job or a business, underwater on a mortgage, or being unable to find affordable housing, losing a family member to conspiracy theories, trying to find love and affirmation in one's identity and orientation, fearing for tomorrow, unable to move beyond mourning, desperately needing friends and understanding. We can identify with that hemorrhaging woman because for the past year, it's felt like 12 years for some of us. And for most of us, life was far from ideal before this past year. We can identify with Jairus and his family. We're people who have seen the loss of potential, of promise, of hope. The question for us is this: do we have faith like them? Faith that healing does and can occur. Now, I know this is complicated because we are completely aware that all of our losses have different impacts on our lives, that we don't all suffer to the same degree. And even more tragically, we see that some are healed and some are not. It just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't seem fair. But God has made that promise, a promise of healing and hope. Do we have the faith to reach out and grab for it? Do we have the faith to ask for it, to cross those lines, to get it, and to cross those lines, to offer it to others? As the new normal begins to come into focus, we have the opportunity to ask ourselves what we want that world to look like. We have the opportunity to live into a healthier normal. For too long, church has been a place where vulnerability and openness have been suppressed in favor of keeping up appearances. We gather online and in person looking for hope and healing, and yet we hide our scars and our wounds and our illnesses from each other. But there is something disruptively impolite about a hemorrhaging woman and her quest for healing. She believed in it. She desired it so much that she disregarded all social norms and prohibitions to get access to it. And she didn't even ask for it. She reached out and touched it because of her faith. Some of us have a hard time admitting that we don't have it all together because we are convinced that there are others that need us to be that person, the one that has it all together. And we don't want to disappoint them. We don't want to let them down. And maybe we feel that despite our hurting, we need to keep it together because we're not sure they'd make it without us. Or so we hide our hurt and our vulnerability. We don't grasp out in the crowd for healing that is available to us. Some of us can't admit we need help because we are too committed to acting like we have it all together. In creating this illusion, both for others and ourselves, we live in a state of denial because we can't handle the vulnerability. And some of us know we don't have it together, but we feel like we can't admit it because we think it's an unacceptable option for those around us. We feel like others just don't want to deal with our scars, our wounds, our hurts, our brokenness. But today, Jesus invites us into a world where vulnerability is the way of life, where transparency inspires transparency, where openness inspires receptiveness, where healing is not only possible, it is promised. So can we pledge today to become a church that changes the way we think about vulnerability? Can we here in this moment when we are wedged away from so many things that we might have used to define our church, we can pledge today to work for a new, healthier normal as a community of Christ, one that isn't defined by a building or a style of music or the clothes we wear or anything that we would use to say to ourselves and each other that we got things under control. Can we in this new normal be a faith community where we don't have it all together? Shouldn't that be our identity? You don't have to have it all together. I don't have it all together. Look, my brain is broken right now. I've fallen into a whole bunch of habits in the past year that are not good for me, and if I'm honest, it's not like I had it all together before this all began. I'm hurting, and I'm burned out. I'm a mess. But you don't need to act like you got it together for my sake or anyone else's sake. We gather looking to grab a hold of that promise of healing and hope. I can't tell you why some are healed and some are not, but I choose today to no longer laugh at the possibility of healing. I choose today to work toward making our next normal way of life defined by vulnerability. I choose today to live a life that pursues healing and hope, not only for myself, but for all around me. So may we have the courage to cross boundaries, to grab a hold of that healing. The promise of healing and hope is true, and it is perfectly summed up in the words of this 19th century African American spiritual. God may not come when you call him, but he will be there right on time. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.